Hello everyone. So today we have Srikar Raghavan with us to discuss about his book Rama Bhima Soma: Cultural Investigations into Modern Karnataka. So firstly, thank you so much, Srikar, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Rishi, for inviting me for reading the book. Very happy to be here.
So I think I want to start with this. Like we are recording this podcast a few days after Banu Mustak's book Heart Lamp shortlisted for the Booker Prize, International Booker Prize. So what is your initial response to that? How did you feel when it got shortlisted?
I mean, there's no other response apart from joy, I would think. It's awards themselves, I'm a bit iffy on them, but they get people to read books. So in that sense, it's a great privilege. And of course, the first Kannada translation that's made it to this. So that's another level. So of course, I'm very delighted. And she does come up in my book a couple of times. I don't engage with her writings deeply, but there are a couple of instances where she comes up in connection with Gauri Lankesh when I'm talking about Gauri Lankesh. So there's an anecdote from the early 2000s about how Banu Mushtaq is a lawyer and an activist, and she's been arguing for women's rights to pray in mosques. And Gauri Lankesh is trying to champion this cause. And so she takes up this issue and she writes a letter to Rahmat Tarikere, the noted scholar. And Tarikere replies saying, let me just see what is happening. I want to take stock of the situation or something. And then Gauri Lankesh hastily condemns him as a fundamentalist or something. So that was an interesting anecdote for me. She was always very fierce, very adversarial in her political positions. And I found a copy of Lankesh Patriki from 2005, celebrating 25 years of that magazine. So this is after Lankesh has died and Gauri has taken over the periodical. And there was it's a very well curated edition. There was one essay by Banu Mushtaq on Dara Shikoh, amongst other things. So these are a couple of instances where she comes up. So I'm very happy that fiction has actually been incorporated into this mainstream discourse. And yeah, hoping that she actually makes the final cut, wins the prize. That would be something, right?
I think that's my hope too. But I want to ask you this: what took Indian regional languages so long to be recognized in this international forum? Is it a matter of they not being translated, or is it a matter of we not getting good translations?
First of all, there was this whole English language, Indian English writing itself. For instance, the most egregious example is Salman Rushdie, who once famously said that some conference something, what do you think of the vernacular regional languages? He said, no, it's all, bright burning and heroism in villages or something like that. So the Indian English environment itself was in some sense prejudiced against regional writing because, of course, they had no idea what was happening. And there was very little translation also. And what translation did exist was quite poor. So their prejudices were amplified by that. So now we have better translations and there's more readership for translation themselves. And there's a better ecosystem for translation. And so you have this new environment where people across the country are trying to read more from their compatriots. And so yeah, it's a gradual process and that is itself evolving. But yeah, we should do more to encourage and sustain this.
So I hope more good translations coming up, more people reading this. So I think now let's go to your book. But before your book, let's talk about yourself, right? So tell me a little bit about yourself. What's in your resume?
Well, I don't know. It's a fairly typical trajectory until like I'm 22 or something. I did engineering. I went for, these coaching classes when I was in 11th and 12th. I was reasonably interested in science and maths, I think. And so when I was 18, I wrote the local CET exam and I got into an engineering into the course and I already knew this was not my cup of tea. First of all, it was a very mediocre teaching environment, and there was the scientific push that I thought I might encounter there was just not there. And I realized I wanted to spend more time reading, and so I joined the college editorial board, and I was I was into quizzing quite a bit when I was in college, because these were places where I could, meet people who had so much passionate interest in books and movies and all sorts of things. So that was a formative experience. And once I did finish engineering, um, I I worked for a year in Bangalore as a copywriter, and then one thing led to another. I was in Manipal, and a friend of mine was studying in Manipal. There was a humanities college, and it felt like a dream place. And so I uh, went there to do my MA, and I absolutely loved it. It was such a big shift from the kind of scene I had been, you know, witnessing in my engineering days. And here, at least, there's a space where they encourage you to read and you talk about all this, and discussions and debates, and so all the diverse fields of study that we were introduced to, sociology and philosophy and uh, history, rigorous history, even philosophy, like what we thought of as, just common sense, wisdom traditions, and this sort of stuff. But you actually encounter very serious logic chopping. And so all of these were very fresh and unprecedented. And I took to it like a fish to water, I think.
So you did your MA in English.
Yeah, I did my MA in English. But from the beginning, the coursework was geared towards regional literatures. So they said, we're not studying Eliot and Shakespeare and Chaucer. You can read them. We encourage you to read them. But the very first course reading that we had in a research methodology course was about the Progressive Writers Association in India. So we were reading Ismet Chugdar and Manto and Mulk Rajan, and then and they also said they encouraged us to read more in our mother tongues, and said there's more work that needs to be done in regional literature. They've been neglected. So even though my MA was in English, and we were trained to write and think and argue and engage with English scholarship, it was also a very concerted push to engage with regional writing and to improve our literary sensibilities in Kannada, in my case. And so that's when I actually picked up my first Kannada book. I never actually learned Kannada properly in a school setting, except in the first standard when I learned to read and write. And after that, I went to CBSE. So we had English, Hindi, and Sanskrit. And I never read a proper Kannada book until I came to my MA. And incidentally, the first book I read was Shivaram Karan's Chomanaduri. And after that, it was just, it became an obsession. I had to catch up with a world that somehow eluded me for a long time.
Okay, so from engineering to doing a master's in English, and you're finally writing a book which is about the cultural and social history of Karnataka, right? And it's just a very comprehensive work, because you're not just going by the conventional archive as a historical source, but you're engaging with literature. You did field interviews, right? And you have written the history of trade union movements, Dalit movement, environmental movements, Naxal movements, everything about Karnataka. So what led you to this? What is the thought process, and what are some of the readings that has prompted you towards this?
Right. It's a very interesting question. In fact, I was reading Sumana Roy's book Provincials like a couple of years ago. I reviewed it also. So where she talks about this idea of provincials having this omnivorous desire for reading material, because you grow up in an atmosphere where it's neither here nor there. So I grew up in Mysore, and It's not exactly the most, it doesn't have like bookshops like Bangalore or something. So I felt like this Kannada world was somehow hovering around me, but I never quite gotten a glimpse of this, whether it is literature or social movements, because I did grow up in a somewhat privileged background. So none of these had really, in any sense, impacted me. So when I was doing my masters and I'm reading, Ananthamurthy and D.R. Nagraj and Devnur Mahadeva, and I discovered that during the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was this extraordinary literary, social, political ferment that just stood in stark contrast to the state of affairs right now, in the sense that there was no timidity or fear in expression, and they were all so invested in fighting it out in this field of ideas, so to speak. And as a student of literature, as a student of history, I was really captivated by these movements and these literary paradigms that they're creating. And so, in fact, one of the first things I read was perhaps a book about Kadidal Shamarna, the farmers' leader from Malnad. Through some random connection, I stumbled upon him, and I discovered this amazing friendship between Purnachandra Tejasvi, Kuvempu's son, and Kadidal Shamarna. I was very moved by the friendship, and also their commitment to socialist ideals. So they were inspired by Gopal Gowda, Shantaveri, another figure whose name I knew from Mysore because there's a hospital named after him close to my house, but I'd never really known what he stood for. So I started reading more about them. And one thing that struck me about these socialist movements was how much fun they were having, in the sense they were living very austere, committed lives. But Shamarna he's learning music, and he's a photographer, he's a passionate lover of antique motorcycles. And so they led such colorful lives, even as they imbued their lives with very specific form of idealism. And this stood in contrast to another thing that it caught my attention around the same time, which is the Naxalite movement in Karnataka. Saketh Rajan, who I talk about in my book. He again he I found a personal valence in Saketh Rajan's story because he was from Mysore. He was from an Iyengar family. He'd gone to science, then quit that, then went to journalism. He goes to IIMC Delhi, where he wins like 4 gold medals, and then he cuts off all of that and gets into this guerrilla Maoist movement. And it struck me that these are two very different conceptions of what politics means. On the one hand, there's this exuberant celebration of life, and on the other hand, there is this dive into a sort of willed martyrdom, in the sense you're taking life so starkly. And Saket himself apparently used to play the mandolin, and he quit that, and nobody from his later years associated him with any kind of music or art. So this was the initial dichotomy that I became fascinated by when I was in my master's. And this was during the pandemic. This was, I think, 2020. And so I was at home trying to write a thesis. So something about these farmers' movements and Saketh Rajan's historiography. So he writes these 2 thick volumes of history. So I was trying to compare these two. The thesis itself was half-baked, nothing really interesting. But this initial fascination sort of set the ground for a much larger interest in what exactly was happening in Karnataka during those times. How do you understand these various ideological strains? On the one hand, both of these are what you might consider left, but the socialist left very much defined itself in opposition to the more radical left revolutionary that someone like Saketh Rajan would come to represent. So how do you make sense of these various trajectories and what these words meant? What is socialism? Or what at least I found salvageable and interesting and uh, worth resurrecting from these worldviews. And from there, uh, I I wrote a proposal to the NIF, a book about chronicling social movements in Karnataka with focus on literature because I was a literature student. And then I got that fellowship, and after that it was, uh, quite set. I felt like I had something to do, and I just started doing it.
Which you have done very prolifically. So now let's talk about your book. Tell us about something about this title, Rama Bhima Soma. Why that title?
Yeah. So it's a game. It's a schoolboys game we used to play in Mysore. In fact, I heard people from Bangalore also said they knew the game the same name. But I've come to realize it's a pan-Indian game. It's so you have all you need is a ball. Play the game. You throw the ball high up in the air, and once it pitches, you count off each pitch as Rama Bhima Soma, and then whoever is closest to the ball picks it up, and then you start hitting everyone around you. And it's a violent game actually, but in the sense that life itself is violent. And there's a metaphor of democracy in there because power is always temporary, it's always changing, it's always self-sought out. We were playing the game because we loved the game, not because the PT teacher had forced us or something. And there is always some accommodation for weakness. If you are close to the guy who's throwing the ball, if you touch him, he can't hit you. So despite its unforgiving nature, there was some accommodation for a weaker person to somehow salvage something out of this game. And it felt like a wonderful metaphor for what I'm trying to talk about, which is this environment in Karnataka in the 70s and 80s, where writers themselves are battling it out in this field of ideas. And even a broader history of 20th century Karnataka. If you look at it from a caste angle, you have in the early 20th century, most administrative positions are dominated by Brahmins. And then you have the non-Brahmin movement that seeks to unseat them from urban power. And then in the 70s, you have the Dalit movement, which is, again, an extension of this quest for justice and representation. So on multiple levels, the game seemed to capture the milieu I'm trying to talk about. And in fact, I never intended it to be the title of the book. I'd put it as a title of the introduction. And when I sent it to my editor, she said, this is the perfect title for the book itself. And it took me a very little time to get convinced. I thought it was a perfect title. And so that's how the name came to be.
So you actually, in your introduction, in your prologue, right, you speak fondly of the 1970s, right, that you already mentioned, right, and you call it an age of chalwalis, right, it's the age of struggle and agitations, the last 3 decades of the century, right? So what was happening then? Why was it the age of chalwalis, as you have characterized it?
On one level, it is reflecting a global ferment. This post 1968 turn in global politics. So you have student protests in Europe, you have civil rights movement in America, there's the Cultural Revolution happening in China, there's anti-colonial self-determination movements in the Third World, and this consciousness is definitely reflected in so many of the movements we see in Karnataka and in India. And just the sheer range of them. You have farmers' mobilizations beginning from the 1980s, which is an extraordinarily popular mobilizations of thousands of people. You have militant trade union struggles. You have street theater. I talk about Samudaya and Prasanna, Hegodu. And you have what might be called the first wave of feminist writers in Kannada, beginning from the 60s onwards. You have Triveni and M.K. Indira. But afterwards, there was a concerted effort by male writers to start encouraging women to write more. Lankesh does this most famously. In fact, he's the one who gives space to Sara Abu Bakr, to Banu Mushtaq, in the pages of Lankesh Patrike. So this is again coinciding with the Bandaya movement. So all of these come together. It struck me to be a very special moment in history. And there was also this notion of the state not being very powerful. This is something I heard from activists I was interviewing in Mysore, for instance, said the state was not so powerful. We could carry out these protests and marches. And in spite of the emergency, which might have actually reinforced the sense of, fighting against the establishment. So these decades witnessed a very unique kind of popular mobilization, and a lot of the activists, almost everyone, remembered these as very nostalgic times where everyone is trying to learn from each other, and there's this idea that society is trying to learn from itself, which again is not a sentiment that you will find very commonly today.
You especially right. You quote Kum Virabhadrappa in your prologue, right? And you say about Dharwad that there is a maxim, right? If a random stone is thrown in Dharwad, it would land on a poet or an artist, right? So I want to ask you something about what led to this movement, right? What was happening before that have given that as such a spur within the state of Karnataka to this age of Chalwalis, the age of struggle and agitations?
One very particular stream of thought that becomes very influential is this brand of Lohiite socialism, which I trace back to Gopal Gowda, Shantaveri, and the failed Kagodu Satyagraha of 1951. And Lohia especially has a very enduring influence on Kannada literati across generations. Whether it is from Kuvempu to Devnur Mahadeva. Like Devnur Mahadeva, remembered in my interview, he said in 1967 when Lohia died, he reads a newspaper obituary, and that was enough to convert him to Lohiite socialism. And Ananthamurthy famously starts writing in Kannada only because of Lohia's call to rejuvenate regional languages. Purnachand Tejvi, Lankesh. So there's an extraordinary influence of Lohia. And there's one more interesting thing about Karnataka is that Gandhi and Ambedkar are not seen as total adversaries, as you might see in other parts of the country. Especially striking is, for me at least, was when I was interviewing or learning about the artists and intellectuals of the Dalit movement, whether it is Devnur Mahadeva, D.R. Nagaraj, or Du Saraswati, they all held Gandhi with great reverence, and they were willing to see his foibles and follies and idealism in a sympathetic light. And one of the reasons I thought this could be the case was the influence of Lohia, because Lohia is this, I see him as a bridge between Gandhi and Ambedkar. On the one hand, he embraces the Gandhian anarchist mode. He doesn't want to be petitioning the state and trying to have this protracted constitutional process. He says, no, we need to start acting as though we are already free. And in that sense, he admires Gandhi. But he also admired Ambedkar's understanding of caste and his emphasis on caste as a more accurate depiction of Indian society. And in this, I might be wrong, but I think Lohia writes a letter to Ambedkar saying, why don't you become a leader of the Indian people in general rather than just the Dalits? And so Lohia becomes a way of bridging Gandhi and Ambedkar. And D.R. Nagaraj is also trying to do the same. He's trying to say that both of them were fighting for internal evaluation of value systems. Gandhi through his reformulated Hinduism, Ambedkar through his neo-Buddhism. And so these ideologies, I felt, had a very profound effect on these social movements, especially the farmers' movement. So M.D. Nanjudaswamy, the leader of the Karnataka Rajya Raita Sangha, he was part of a socialist youth group in the late 60s, early 70s. He had been by Gopal Gowda's side during his deathbed. In fact, I found a trade union leaders like Anant Subbarao. He too said he had been inspired by Gopal Gowda. So wide variety of leftist movements had in somehow branched off from these initial strains of idealism. And if you want to go even further back, again, there's this great influence of Gandhi on Kannada literati of the early 20th century, whether it is Kuempu or D.V. Gundappa, Shivaram Karanth. They really looked up to him in different ways, but there is this source of a very sincere pluralism and honesty that informs these movements. Like there is one very moving anecdote from the farmers' movement that I record in the book. So on the mid 80s, there was this huge Rasta Roko protest by the Raita Sangha, and some tens of thousands of farmers had been jailed. And what happens in one of these jails is because a lot of these farmers had never seen indoor toilets, they refused to go to the jail bathroom. They started relieving themselves in the cells itself. And there's one freedom fighter, a Gandhian freedom fighter. His name is Singanamanis Siddhalingappa. I might be wrong. But he starts cleaning all this mess himself and stunning all of them into shame. And then afterwards, they start obeying him, and they start going to the bathrooms. So this Gandhian influence on these social movements, especially environmental movements, was quite profound. And so these are, I think, the prehistories of the movements of the 70s and 80s. And it's quite astonishing. And I only scraped the surface, I think. There's so much more to be said, so much more that couldn't make it into the book. But I hope it's a broad introduction to the various idealism. This idealism is, again, the one thing that I took away from all my conversations. They wanted to have the space where money and corruption and caste prejudice wouldn't affect their perspective on life. And it is this idealism, again, that somehow needs to be rescued, I think.
Okay, two strands that we are discussing here. I mean, first was the Lohia influence on the Kannada literature in the sense, which is very interesting. But while you have spoken right now very fondly about Lohia's influence on literature, but in your chapter where you're trying to explore the socialism as a political movement and ideological movement in Karnataka, I have, as far as I understood, you wrote in a sense that the socialism in Karnataka lacked both ideological clarity on one side. On the second side, they failed to educate the oppressed masses, and that's why it did not take the top-notch form that the potential it had. So, would you reflect on that?
Yeah. So if you look at the first real flush of socialism, it's the Kagodu Satyagraha, 1951. It is a failure in all its professed goals. It doesn't really. There's no land to the tiller. Most of the laborers go back to bonded labor. The only solace is that Gopal Gowda Shantaveri manages to win the Sagara elections, and he comes to the Legislative Assembly. And there's a very good book by G. Rajshekar on the Kagoda Satyagraha, which is what I rely on. And he says, apart from Gopal Gowda, it's very difficult to see other socialists of this time having any great understanding of what needs to be done. And the most of the masses they're trying to, you know, rally weren't actually aware of what Lohia stands for. And another interesting detail about the Kagodu Satyagraha I learned was that they didn't include the lowest caste, the Dalits, in the struggle, so much so that the Dalits actually defended the Gowda, the landlord, in the court, and they allowed themselves to be used as henchmen to put down the Satyagraha as well. And when I was thinking about this and trying to see if they improved on this in any way, I stumbled across another land struggle called the Hebballi Horata, which is in North Karnataka. This happened in like 1957 or something. This was led by a man named Neelagangaya Pujar. And here they improved on it in the sense they incorporated Dalits into their struggle. But again, there was this sense of triumphalism where he, Mr. Pujar, has a negotiation with the government, something, and then he thinks everything is gung ho, and then he goes off somewhere else. And what I learned was that later critics said there was no real agreement. It was not a well-sustained negotiation. So this triumphalism, this idea that you have this horata, the struggle, and then once that's over, everything's going to fall into place. That too was a little naive. And there were these differences between socialists themselves. So Gopal Gowda Shantaveri and Neil Gangai Pujar apparently did not get along with each other. So all of these reasons muddled the socialist cause, so much so that by the end of the 60s, when Indira Gandhi is, going down on privy purses and so on, there were so many socialists who actually protested against this. So an anti-Congressism had replaced any real socialist ideals. And I mean, this is true of the country at large. I think after 2 decades of Congress rule, there was a lot of discontent in the political sphere. We need to somehow oppose the Congress, and other ideas took a hit.
No, this reminds me of an earlier podcast I did with Rahul Ramagundam, the George Fernandez one, right? Being the firebrand socialist he is, joined hands with BJP to an extent of, in a way, defending Modi for 2002 Godhra riots because of the anti-Congressism that was deeply ingrained in him, right?
Yeah.
So can we say that they did not see the movements to the end? Okay, before that, can you tell a little bit more about both Gopal Gowda Shantaveri as well as the Kagoda Satyagraha, so we get more context about it?
So the Kagoda Satyagraha, it was basically an issue over something called a Kolaga, which is a vessel. The Gowda, or the landlord of the village, simply known as Kagoda Gowda, he would use a smaller Kolaga to distribute grains to the tenants. But when collecting his tax, he would use a bigger Kolaga. It is a very open system of exploitation. And so this was, in some sense, the tip of the iceberg of this whole struggle. On broader scale, it was a much larger protest against bonded labor. I mean, not extremely serious bonded labor, because these were still tenants. They had land to till on, and they were not landless like the Dalits who didn't make it to that struggle. And so the socialists, led by a man named Ganapati Appa, who had himself been a part of Quit India in 1942, so they, throughout the late 1940s, they're planning a new political response, way to unseat landlords from key positions in the Congress. And this is the problem, that so many of the Congress leaders were landed elites, so no reforms could be expected from their quarters. Many, like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, had tried in debates that go back to the 1930s, but all of these had been quashed by elite landed interests. And so this Kolaga issue becomes a trigger point, and they start protesting against it. And the Cargo to Gowda basically bands together with all the other landlords of the region. They say, nonsense, who are you to tell us all this? We're not going to follow this. We will evict you from this land. You have no right to till in this land. And as a protest against this, they started symbolically tilling the land because the monsoon is going to arrive soon, and they have to do it before that. And as they are symbolically tilling this land, the Gowda had told the police that these guys are infringing, and then they would arrest them. And at some point, it became so routine that they wouldn't even take that flows to till the land. They would just take coconut fronds or something, because at least then the flows would remain safe at home and not land up in the police station. And so this happened, and there's support from a broader socialist party as well. Ram Manohar Lohia comes. Jayaprakash Narayan also comes to Sagra to visit the jail protesters, to give them support. They're also arrested and packed off to Bangalore jail or something. And ultimately, after this, the movement fritters away. Many of them go back to the Gowda's employ, and except for a few, like this one man called Kanase Jatya, who I bring up in the book, he refuses to enter the services of the Gowda, preferring to live an independent life, finding work wherever he might. And he was a hero of sorts for the Diva community, who were at the forefront of this protest, and they would remember his singular, courage for decades to come. This is what G. Rajshekhar records in his book on Kagoda Satyagraha. And it is from this, and Gopal Gowda Shantaveri was at the heart of this movement. He was part of the Socialist Party. He was very much involved in the Satyagraha. And interestingly, the Satyagraha is also a key turning point in the life of U.R. Ananthamurthy, whose father owns a printing press in Tirthalli, which is where the socialists print all their pamphlets and so on. This is where he meets Gopal Gowda Shantaveri, and he looks up to him as a political guru. And Gopal Gowda himself is an extraordinarily idealistic character. And to the end of his life, he did not own a house of his own. He lived in a rented house, lived in dire poverty, and it's almost quixotic. You can't imagine that kind of an idealism today. And but he inspired and motivated generations of Kannada writers. He himself was an extraordinarily well-read man, and he was known for quoting poetry and expounding on Kannada literature in his speeches. And this is again part of a lost world for me. How many politicians do you see today who can talk about literature or even respect writers? I don't know.
I remember somewhere in your book you write about Gopal Gowda that if you go to him to listen a political lecture in a rally, you might end up listening to a lecture on literature, right?
Yeah, Purnachandra Tejasvi's recollection.
Yes.
So he records somewhere in an essay where he's trying to navigate what is this line between art and activism. And he says it is full of paradoxes. If you went to Gopal Gowda Shantaveri to talk about politics, he'd be talking about poetry or Gopal Krishna Adiga or something like that. If you went to Ananthamurthy to talk about literature, then he would introduce you to socialists in the region, and then inspire you to be part of the struggle and so on. So everybody recalls this curious mixture of art and activism that the Lohiite socialists bequeathed. with great fondness, and it felt to me very unique. Very little of that kind of mixture that you see today.
Okay, so second thing that we have discussed earlier when we are discussing about Lohia is how he acted as a bridge between Gandhi and Ambedkar, right? And you also spoke about D.R. Nagaraj, right? In one of his essays in Flaming Feet, he writes about how we need both Gandhi and Ambedkar. Like they both are seeing the caste question as a value question, in a sense, right? And I also fondly remember an earlier essay written by Ramchandra Guha during the CAA protests, right? So how we have both the photos of Ambedkar and Gandhi
Yeah.
next to each other. And in that essay, he especially writes about how this idea of bringing Gandhi and Ambedkar together comes from Devnur Mahadeva, right? So, I mean, after studying Gandhi's archives across the world, Ram Guha finds the literature in the Karnataka trying to bring these two ideas together. So, would you reflect a little bit more on how the D.R. Nagaraj has approached this specific question?
Yeah. Nagraj, he simply divides it into land and value. He says there's the land school, which is the Marxist school, which said you need land reforms, you need material, economic upliftment before anything else can be, achieved. And then he has what he calls the value school, which is the reorganization of value systems from within. And this is what I mentioned earlier: Gandhi's New Hinduism, Ambedkar's New Buddhism, which is trying to combat untouchability at its roots by challenging that sense of impurity and pollution and uh, uh, vague associations with spirituality that this somehow connects to. And for them, that is more important because that is what has been perpetuating this. So even if you have land reforms, though Ambedkar does come around to land reforms later in his life, the last few years of his life, he begins to realize that this is an important uh, struggle too. And I mean, when I first read this, I thought this is a very good, framework, an academic framework, perhaps, to understand this. But the more I talked about this with activists in Kolar, for instance, the more I felt that this was not a dead debate. In fact, Marxists even now tend to argue that there should be more emphasis on land. And on the other hand, the Ambedkarites do argue that there is a broader need for a cultural rejuvenation, a much more wholesome way to, combat this. And so, in this sense, Nagaraj's insight was it was not fossilized in the 80s or 90s when he's writing. It's still there. It's still an important way to approach this.
Okay, before we again discuss more about the caste question, I want to go to your first chapter, right? Titled Marga Desi and the Battle of Identities, which is one of the longest chapters in your book, right? What is this Marga Desi binary that you're talking about?
So this actually is one of the oldest uh, binaries in some sense. I actually see it more as a metaphor rather than a strict binary. So this goes back all the way to the Kaviraja Marga of the 9th century, which is the first extant Kannada text. And the Kaviraja Marga is trying to fuse the Desi with the Marga in the sense that Kannada uh, Kannada with Sanskrit, the broader Sanskrit cosmopolis, as Sheldon Pollock called it. So he's, or the Sri Vijaya, the writer of the Kaviraj Marga, is trying to inaugurate a new kind of poetics. He's inspired by Sanskrit works like Sanskrit poeticians like Dandin and so on. And but there's a very acute sense of what is Desi and what should be Marga. I quote an instance where he uses musical instruments to talk about this difference. He talks about folk instruments and saying if these Kannada words are used with these Sanskrit words, then it sounds like these folk instruments, maybe we should not do it. But if certain other words are used in conjunction, then they sound like mridangam, which is like a classical form of uh, percussion. And so there's this sense of a social understanding of what is Desi, what should be Marga, what is folk, what should be classical. And so this binary of Marga Desi appears across centuries, and not just in Kannada. Like in Marathi, I think it's called Margi and Deshi. It's an Indian phenomenon where Marga is this representation of this cosmopolitan world of social elites and technical urban excellence, and um, uh, Desi is this indigenous genius that thrives because it is completely away from these notions of power and prestige and so on. So much so that the author himself is an incidental figure. It's more about the evolution of ideas and stories and art for art's sake in a very pure sense. And this Marga Desi becomes a very interesting tool to talk about various cultural phenomena. And it's not like they're always combative, they're often collaborative. Desi styles and idioms are often great inspiration for the Marga to rejuvenate its own depleted reserves, and the Desi often finds a remembrance in the Marga canon, and it's D.R. Nagaraj who talks about the Vachanas, for instance. The Vachanas are part of the 12th century Sharana revolution, to that sought to critique notions of hierarchy and impurity and this triumvirate of the temple king and the Rajguru, as Priya Nagaraj called it. And so the Vachanas were actually standardized and collected and compiled into digests and commentaries only in the 15th century, which is like 2 centuries after what the events of Basavanna and his cohort. Yeah, so what Nagaraj observes is, look, if you see the 15th century, how this new generation of Veerashaiva theologians and intellectuals standardized Vachana literature, it's difficult to say whether this means the success or failures of the Vachana. On the one hand, it is only this that actually enables the Vachanas to be transmitted, for them to somehow reach us these many centuries later. But on the other hand, they are also, in many ways, subsumed into a new orthodoxy that is not so keen on preserving the more radical ideas that the Vachanas themselves espouse. So it is a case of the Marga preserving the Desi for posterity, but also diluting it in some way. And in fact, there's so much scholarship on like Allama Prabhu, for instance. Manu Devadevan has translated Allama Prabhu's Vachanas, and it's called God is Dead, There Is No God. That's the connection of poems, and he writes in his introduction, it's everything that happened after the 12th century was travesty, because they didn't understand the critique of these ideas of liberation itself that someone like Allama Prabhu is embarking on. And so it is subsumed into a religious orthodoxy, but these guys were actually trying to transcend these notions of organized religion and bhakti and the very idea of liberation itself. So this interplay between Marga and Desi is very interesting, very complex, and it is an interesting tool even when you come to the 20th century, when you have a new Marga, which is the Anglophone world. That's the Sanskrit cosmopolis is not so influential anymore. There's no need for that, but the desire for English that someone like Kuvempu writes about. He says, how could we live without learning English, the language of our overlords? And he starts writing long Victorian English poems, inspired by Romanticism, until the Irish poet James Cousins tells him, this is a little pretentious. Why don't you write in Kannada? And that's when he starts writing in Kannada. But there was no doubt that this new world of English letters was the inspiration for the new Kannada Renaissance, or Navodaya as it was called. B.M. Shrikantaya writes his famous English Geetagalu, which is very direct translation of English songs. And so I find it a very interesting tool to talk about all sorts of things. In fact, I even use it to talk about Rajkumar having. So Rajkumar creates this new form of Kannada, which, according to Ananthamurthy, finally realizes the Kaviraja Marga's dream of creating a pan-Karnataka Kannada, because that's when there is a mass audience for one kind of Kannada, which is Rajkumar's very special, somewhat textbook kind of tone. But because this is the first time this is being articulated, it doesn't feel artificial. It feels very original. And but of course, this new marga in Kannada cinema, started by Rajkumar, is challenged by other more desi players, perhaps, like Upendra's Upendra, which is just an outright critique of established film tropes. And so this tool, when you place it in certain contexts, I think it's very helpful to illuminate certain phenomenon. But if you try to take it much more than that, and you try to find essences and some kind of a running, template across history, then that might be a bit suspect. But Marga Desi, everyone I talk to has their own notion of what this might mean, even if they've never heard of this binary before. And so I think it's a very thought-provoking tool to examine culture, because culture is always framed through these kind of contestations. It's never going to end. So that's why this is an eternal battle between the local and the universal, between the regional and the cosmopolitan. And it is always going to be there in one way or the other. And culture, if it is not dynamic, if it is not saying, okay, you're doing this, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do it slightly differently, I'm going to invert it, I'm going to subvert it. Without that idea of subversion, there is no culture as such. So in that sense, it is in some sense, an eternally useful binary. Keep informing how we view what is happening around us.
No, while you have articulated the Desi in terms of the indigenous, right, the more free thing, right, while you already talked about D.N. Nagaraj, you also quote D.N. Nagaraj as one of the paragraphs where he writes, and I quote, Desi Vada is not an argument involving rhetoric, but an argument involving anxiety. Stop quote. So do I understand it in terms of indigenous being scared in terms of being usurped by the popular, right? So how do you see
Yeah.
this?
So this, I found it very interesting. So this new kind of Desi Vada that Nagaraj is talking about here, it's in the post-colonial context. And I think he's responding both to the rise of the Hindu right, with its very exclusionary ideas of culture and nationalism, and also to the decline of the Dalit movement and its own aspirations to a new form of intellectual Desivada. And this again goes back to the Sharana revolution. This idea of seeing in the past a source of pluralism, a history of social movements, and egalitarianism, critique of organized religion, patriarchy, all of which are in some sense modern ideas, but for many, including Nagaraj and even A.K. Ramanujan, who translated the Vachanas. So they saw in these Vachanas great sources of idealism that we might call modern, that might be very relevant from our own times. And Nagaraj himself was advocating this new form of Desivada, and he saw some grave pitfalls in this mode of argumentation. He found it could be very naive, it could be ahistorical, especially in the case of the Hindu right. And one of the things that Nagaraj is trying to say is that the deep impact of colonialism is that it convinces us somehow that colonial modernity is the only form of modernity we have at all. And it includes a history of other forms of modernism, indigenous modernism, which you might see in the Sharana movement, in the Vachanas. And Nagaraj's emphasis on rhetoric here intrigued me. This was in an interview. It's on YouTube, and he's delivering a speech in Kannada, but he uses the English word rhetoric, and it struck me an interesting choice because rhetoric is, in some sense, an acknowledged philosophical subject. You go back all the way to Aristotle and his diatribes against the sophists who believe that argument is greater than truth itself, in the sense you have to convince people not towards an already predetermined conclusion. And so Aristotle disliked this. He said they don't want to pursue truth. They're merely interested in these instrumental ends. And this is what he calls rhetoric. But Nagaraj is saying this Desi Vada, it's not just rhetoric, it's anxiety. And that is a much more deeper cause of worry, because if you descend into anxiety, you get into this fight or flight mode, and that breeds a militant radicalism, a kind of exclusivism, extremism. And he wants us to guard against this anxiety, because that achieves nothing. And again, it's so relevant to the kind of things we're seeing around us, right? There's this very ahistorical sense of this great Desi essence that the conservative rights wants to excavate, and this glorious past that is unlikely to have existed. And so in all these ways, I think Nagaraj's reflections are very important to reflect on, very relevant.
Can we reflect a bit on the R.K. Narayan movement, right? So when R.K. Narayan started writing in English and became globally popular, right? And in this context, you write in your book, and I quote, "If Sanskrit was the road to Marga cosmopolitanism at the end of first millennium, its position was slowly but wholly usurped by English education at the end of the second." Now, does this rise of English in the regional literature when R.K. Narayan starting, is it also a kind of anxiety which Nagaraj was trying to talk about?
R.K. Narayan himself was a very modernist figure. And I mean, I compare the fact that Graham Greene, in some sense, champions R.K. Narayan, secures him an entrance into the English marga, so to speak. And there is if you read R.K. Narayan's novels, in his initial works, his English is still a bit raw. He's still trying to, digest this foreign language, and it gets more and more sure as he progresses. And unlike other writers of his generation, Narayan is actually able to create a new mythology. In a sense, this new town called Malgudi, surrounded by the river Sarayu, and in this sense, he's channeling a form of Desi thinking, I think. But in so many other senses, he struck me to be a very staunchly modernist writer. He writes, I think there's a book called gods, demons, and others, where he has a few stories on Indian mythology and so on. But apart from that, I don't know if he was ever really very interested in these regional cultural pasts as much as someone like D.R. Nagaraj was, for instance. And so Narayan is a new kind of marga, perhaps, in Indian English marga. But they did hold on to uh, whatever cultural inheritances that they found most appealing. And in their own ways, in different measures, all of these writers are trying to challenge or are trying to channel the Desi into their own new margas.
No, I remember was reading something by Kushwant Singh, and Kushwant Singh was saying he's surprised about why R.K. Narayan sells. Uh, sense that he's writing about a imaginary village, etc., etc. And Kushwant Singh believes in one dictum that only sex sells in India. So, it was very interesting to see how R.K. Narayan has laid this new mark
Yeah,
guide.
and he was not really accepted by the Kannada world. I think in Lankesh, in his autobiography, he writes, "I never had any respect for R.K. Narayan. We found him of little relevance." And I think when R.K. Narayan's home in Mysore was being transformed into a museum, a lot of Kannada writers protested against it. Who's this? Why would you give so much importance? So he was never accepted by the Kannada world of letters. They found him suspect, and I'm not sure how R.K. Narayan himself reacted to that. I think he he didn't care much.
He has his market, so you don't have to, I think,
Yeah.
bother about it. Because I don't think there can be any English textbook right now without one story by R.K. Narayan for sure, right? Or one excerpt. So that's one sentiment about it. Okay, I want to ask you one more thing because we talked about the Kannada literature, right? In your book, you actually talks about the Kannada literature being the four key movements, right, in the literary world, right? The Navodaya, the Pragatashila, the Navya, and the Dalita Bandaya, right? So, can you tell us a little bit about these movements? Because you write in your book after talking about this, and I quote, these four movements can be understood in relation to each other, playing out like a thoroughly engrossing four-act play across the wide stage of the 20th century Kannada literature. So, can you take us through them?
Um, I think it was Dr. Rajendra Chenny who told me there is only one literary movement, and that is Navodaya. Everything else is, in some sense, a reaction to that or a response to that. It's an interesting statement. So Navodaya, again, it's this new Kannada renaissance with great focus on linguistic glory and trying to use this to create the state known as Karnataka, which is again a new thing, people to identify, to assemble these various, jigsaw pieces of Karnataka through the lens of this language. It's an extraordinarily difficult task, and so this is the task that the Navodaya movement was confronted with, and it had something exalted about it, and which is why when you have the next turn, which is called Pragatashila or progressive, which is writers like Basavaraj Kattimani, Anakru, and who are inspired by the Progressive Writers Association, socialism, the freedom struggle. So they're saying, look, the trials and tribulations of ordinary people, of the working class, this does not feature in this Navodaya aesthetic. So we need to uh, bring that sensibility into it. And so this becomes the tone and tenor of a lot of writers in the 30s and 40s. And there's another writer, Tara Subbarao, who initially is part of this new progressive style, but then he abandons that and he joins the new modernist or Navya, as it is called. And the biggest figurehead of the Navya movement is the poet Gopal Krishna Adiga. And I have excerpts from some of his letters to Basavaraj Kattimani, so who was his very good friend in the 40s and 50s. So he grows up looking up to Basavaraj Kattimani, exchanges long cordial letters. But in the early 50s, this tone changes. So he's having big arguments on what art is. And he says, look, art can't be restricted to mere ideological agendas and political, scaffolding. You need something more. There's art for art's sake is, in some sense, incontestable. That is what gives art its mysterious, invaluable charm. So you see Adiga growing out of his progressivist leanings, and so there's this new emphasis on the individual, not just this collective struggle, but the idea of subjective self who has been neglected by literature, who has failed to, in some sense, discover himself or herself. And so this becomes the new Navya movement. And here too, there are certain figures um, from what is happening in Europe at the time, Camus and Sartre. And so they become interesting references for this new cohort, whether it's Ananthamurthy, Adiga, Lankesh. So they become new lodestars for this literary aesthetic. And in a couple of decades, again, this is challenged by the emergence of what is broadly called the Dalit Bandai, which is something that becomes popular as a phrase only from the 80s onwards. But already in 1973, you have a collection of short stories by Purnachandra Tejasvi called Abachur in a Post Office. And in the foreword to this, he's already saying we need to rethink this Navya aesthetic. We need to go back to, again, this inspiration of Lohiite socialism also informs this new sensibility, I think. And so this Tejasvi is a foreword to this collection of stories is seen as the first literary inauguration of a new way of thinking about literature. And again, in some sense, history begins to rhyme with what had come earlier. So there is more emphasis on the collective, on new forms of solidarity. And the Bandaya movement itself was a kind of subaltern umbrella to shelter religious minorities, women, Dalits, and to, again, contest this new or this elite form of literature, which is best encapsulated in the Busa incident, again, 1973, where B. Basavalingappa says all Kannada literature is Busa. It's just, we don't see ourselves reflected in this. We want to inaugurate our own form of literary expression. And the Bandaya conference held in 1979 in Bangalore, on the same day that the Kannada Sahitya Parishad is having its conference in Dharmasthala, this very religious town, where Gopal Krishna Adiga is supposed to be delivering the keynote address. And so the new writers, they submit a petition saying we want a section dedicated to Dalit literature in the Kannada Sahitya Parishad. And they get a response saying there's no such thing as Dalita, Balita, Kalita. What are you saying? So this incenses them, and they start off this rebellious Bandaya Sahitya Sammelana on the very day that this is happening as a protest against these elite values. And I write that this is a Rama Bhima Soma moment, because Gopal Krishna Adiga himself in the 1950s, he is writing that Kuempu and Masti are part of the old generation. We shouldn't count them as living writers anymore. We should start our own movement. And so it tells you that each generation has to fight for its own ideals, and that's what they did. And they're always a friend and an enemy to their predecessors. And I found great solace in this because it tells you that you too are part of a system where it is the right of a new generation to rebel and to re-articulate its positions. And if anything, history tells us it is that it is through these moments that the most dynamic and memorable historical trajectories have begun to take shape.
Okay, one thing that you have said when you're talking is about the art and the activism part of it, right? And you have explored this idea greatly when you're talking about Kota Shivram Karant, right? Where he engaged with the idea of art and activism. Can you throw some reflections on that?
Yeah, he Karanth himself was both an artist and activist. He was a very staunch environmentalist. The last 2 decades of his life, he spent participating in environmentalist movements, and so he's in the 1920s, when during his formative years, he's very much inspired by Gandhi, and so he goes around spreading ideas of brahmacharya, abolition of untouchability, and but at some point he gets disenchanted with this form of Gandhian idealism, and he was also participating in theater. He was writing a lot of plays, and he says at some point this just becomes propaganda when you have all these characters on stage disgorging these causes, whether it's khadi or untouchability. It's great, the crowd cheers, but is it really art? And he says, I feel it can only uh, become art when you allow the audience to come to their own conclusions, when you're not already, imposing these views on them, however well intentioned they might be. And so I bring that up as a passing quotation, but that chapter on Karanth itself, I focus more on the art. It's called the aesthetic universals of South Canara, and in some sense, I wanted to separate the art from the politics, just as a uh, way of trying to see what that would amount to, you know. And Karan, uh, I talk about his novel Mogapadada Mana, which is nobody reads this novel. It's a very unknown novel. It's not his famous. It's not in his famous roster of novels. But I found it interesting because he's writing it immediately at the cusp of independence. It's in 1948 or something. And he's trying to reflect on what it means to have these artistic ideals in this very impoverished, illiterate landscape. How do you survive as an artist? How do you hold up these ideals? And he does this through the character of a dancer who has these very noble ideas of dance shouldn't pander to commercial interests, and it should reflect a broader internal struggle. And he falls to cynicism. This is something Karanth himself experienced during his travels. That there is very little space for this kind of uh, uh, artistic idealism in a world of emerging commerce and money. So I found it interesting, and I mean, I would like to hear from readers what they thought of it. I have no greater motive in presenting it something, apart from the fact that it tied into other traditions of uh, dance and art that I talk about in the chapter as well.
No, I think in your first chapter itself, a little bit going back, you
Mm.
quote Sri Sri, right, a Telugu poet, saying, "I'm a prostitute," right? Because when he started writing
Yeah,
about,
yeah,
started writing songs for the music after this high communist
yeah.
poetry, was he also facing this dilemma in his mind between art and activism when he initially started out with?
Yeah, no doubt. That's a good connection. That's what this is. I got it from Prasanna Hegodu's recollections. This again is the 1979 Bandaya conference where Sri arrives drunk, arrives late, and says, I'm a prostitute, I've started writing for films and all. And so this is a constant battle. Again, there's no easy conclusions to this. Where is the line between art and activism? They're enmeshed. They're inextricable. There will always be two sides of the same coin. And throughout my interviews, I kept hearing metaphors from all sorts of interesting perspectives. For instance, Kumvi Bhadrappa, so he has this interesting bifurcation called Upadravi and Nirupadravi, which is disruptive and non-disruptive writers. Disruptive writers is constantly challenging the status quo, questioning those in power. And I asked him, look, can you spell this out for me? And he had this amazing metaphor. He said, look, if you're riding a cycle, are you focusing more on the sitting part or the riding part? If you focus more on the sitting part, then you're a non-disruptive writer. Happy with the status quo. You write beautifully, perhaps, but you're not really interested in pushing forward. And then if you're pedaling onwards, and that requires struggle and concerted effort. And this again resonated with another metaphor. I bring up K.K. Hebba's painting of a man pushing a bicycle where the head has been dislodged and it's looking back at this incomprehensible past, but the feet is pushing onwards. You can only get into the future. The past is gone. But how do you reconcile yourself with this? How do you reconcile in a broader political scenario of an extreme right that is hell-bent on going to a past and an extreme left that is pushing towards an mechanically imagined future utopia. So throughout my book, I think there are resonances of this binary, this tussle between art and activism, between the past and the future, between contentment and, in some sense, dissatisfaction, between the desire to somehow relinquish yourself into the establishment and, on the other hand, try to challenge it and hope for a better world. So yeah, it's a continuous theme in the book. In fact, one of the earliest titles I had for the book was Art and Activism in Contemporary Karnataka. So that was a thread that I kept thinking about, and it has found its way into the book as well.
No, I think I one more metaphor which I remember is Ananthamurthy's front yard and backyard.
Yeah.
The front yard is where men come and meet the artistic bigger politics, whereas the backyard is where the real struggle. And it's interesting that he placed the woman in the backyard when he is making this metaphor. I think that's where my next question is, right? So all these men that we have talked about, great men across all these literary movements, how did they treat women characters in their literature? Would you like to reflect on that?
Yeah, because you brought up Ananthamurthy, I'll talk about it in the context of Ananthamurthy and S.L. Byrappa, who I compare, especially in this regard. So I describe Ananthamurthy and Byrappa as two brothers fighting for the attention of the mother, in some sense. If you look at their literary oeuvre, they're trying to talk about very similar things in different ways, but also similar ways. Ananthamurthy's novel Samskara is published around the same time as Byrappa's Vamshavriksha. Both are reflections on Brahminical orthodoxy and how to, respond to the arrival of modernity, which completely decimates these ways of thinking about the world. Ananthamurthy's novel Bhartipura and Byrappa's novel Datu, early 70s, both are meditations on intercaste relations. And I also compare their portrayal of women. And it was Pratibha Nandakumar who in my interview with her, she spoke about Ananthamurthy's female characters. And she said, look, I presented a paper with Ananthamurthy in the audience where I critiqued his portrayal of women. And he didn't have any answer to it. And I began thinking about this, and it struck me that in both of their worlds, there is a similar prohibitive notion. If you look at Ananthamurthy's novels, say Samskara, you have Chandri, who is Naranappa's keep prostitute. She enables Pranesha Acharya's epiphany. They have a moment of lovemaking, and then suddenly Pranesha Acharya's orthodox world is shattered. But apart from this, Chandri is a peripheral character. She doesn't really have her own interiority. Ananthamurthy doesn't bother trying to present that. In his next novel, Bhartipura, you have this character, Jagannatha, who's trying to get Dalits into the temple. He has a lover, Margaret. She's somewhere away in UK or something. Again, a marginal presence in the book. In Avasthe, his next novel, he fictionalizes Gopal Gowda Shantaveri. Again, the women characters are they're on the periphery. They come in when the primary character is searching for something, and then he finds that this offers solace. And so, and even in Byrappa's novels, there is in Vamshavriksha, the woman Katyayani, her husband dies, she remarries, but she's forced to go through numerous miscarriages and she dies an early, painful death. In Datu, there's this promise of intercaste marriage, but it doesn't happen, and the woman becomes a sannyasi. It's a very weird turn in the story. So, and Byrappa is able to achieve a kind of feminism in his retellings of epics, whether it is his portrayal of Sita in Uttarakhanda or Gandhari in Parva. But when it comes to modern society and women engaging with modernity with passion and vigor, they're never quite able to do it. And this is something a lot of Kannada women writers pointed out. And there are some exceptions to this in the Navya movement. Shantinath Desai and Lankesh, they wrote some exceptional stories which can genuinely be called feminist, I think. But apart from that, there were very few. Even Purnachandra Tejasvi, I couldn't find in any of his novels or stories that I read this championing of women and situating them within a modern context with a kind of positive spirit. It felt it was missing. And so, yeah, there's a lot to be desired, when you start looking at this canonical Kannada male writer sphere. They weren't really invested in this. And I have this interesting excerpt where the Kannada writer Vaidehi is talking to Shivram Karant, and she asks him, "Look, have you read these women's literature?" He says, "No." And she asks him, "Why?" He said, "It just hasn't come to my ambit yet. I will read it sometime, maybe." So there's this very, it is sort of callousness perhaps, but it never really transpires, this show of feminism, this literary imagination to allow women to, become full characters in themselves.
No, so here is where I want to ask you another question, right? Where were women writers? Because in your work, you also write after 12th century, after Akka Mahadevi, right? And you say that women are conspicuously absent in the literary scene, right? Is it because their works did not get the popularity or the women were not writing? So how do we see their absence?
I speak about it only in the Kannada sense, because if you look at other languages, there's an extraordinary woman in the Vijayanagar Empire called Odu Tirumalamba. I think 16th century. She writes extraordinary works in Sanskrit, for instance. But Kannada itself, to the best of my knowledge, I might be wrong or I might not have investigated in great detail, but there's a conspicuous lack of Kannada female voices until you come to the 17th century, where you have Sanchi Honnamma, who's a courtesan in Chikkadevaraj Odayar's palace, and she writes this work that is again detailing wifely duties to a husband and so on. And you arrive in the 20th century, again, you have widows who are allowed the solace of devotional poetry, and this is again a running historical theme. There's another woman I mentioned, Galagali Avva, again, I think 16th or 17th century, I might be wrong, who was married to a man who was 90 years old or something like that. She's widowed, and then she learns to write from her sons. And in the early 20th century, you have Nanjangud Tirumalamba, an extraordinary woman who teaches herself Kannada, Tamil, Telugu. She's writing short stories. She's, I think, publishing journals and so on. And she's critiqued by Masti Venkatesh Iyengar for writing a story where husband apologizes to his wife. He feels it's too unbecoming or whatever. So repeatedly you encounter women who are constantly struggling to establish themselves, fighting against patriarchy. Another egregious example is M.K. Indira in the early 60s. So she writes this novel called Tungabhadra, and she sends it to Manohar Granthamala in Dharwad, where the famous critic Kirtinath Kurtukoti has got the manuscript. He loses the manuscript on a train in Mumbai, and for 2 years they're actually debating amongst themselves. So should we tell M.K. Indira? Should we, write off the novel in our own style and then tell her we published it? I thought it was extraordinary that they're actually thinking about this. And then after this, they write a letter to M.K. Indira saying, look, we lost the manuscript, we're very sorry. And she rewrites the manuscript and she sends it over, and then it's published and becomes very popular. But by this time, her friend, Tribeni, who was the one who actually encouraged M.K. Indira to write and all, she has died after a sketchy delivery, and she never gets to read M.K. Indira's novel. So all of these are very poignant and moving anecdotes to me, how much women have struggled to establish themselves. And so in light of this, efforts of someone like Lankesh in the 1980s come across as very revolutionary in some sense.
Now, here I want to bring out another character, Pratibha Nandakumar, right? In your book, you write that one Kannada poet have criticized her, saying that she got her poems published easily because she is a Brahmin, right? And you quote her, Pratibha Nandakumar, responding it with a poem saying, I quote, can one drop one's Brahminhood as easily as one's bra? When I stood at the door, all ready to embark on my journey, all they saw was 7 generations behind my back, right? So it is not just the male dominated literary scene, but women were also competing their caste as a way of their glory, right? So, how do we see this?
Yeah, but this anti-Brahminism, it affects both men and women in the 70s. It's a dominant tenor of those times. Ananthamurthy writes in his autobiography of Lankesh coming to visit him, saying, look, I understand that you feel this is in somehow personally affecting you, because Ananthamurthy is not invited to literary conferences or meetings because he's a Brahmin and this sort of stuff. And Lankesh tells him, you have to accept it as the theme of our times. It's a historical necessity, be patient, and this kind of stuff. And there is very strong rhetoric of anti-Brahminism. This was only to be expected. It would be difficult to imagine otherwise. And Ananthamurthy also recognizes it, and he says, responding to the Busa controversy, for instance, he says, history is a cycle. You have to allow new voices to emerge. Otherwise, we are not creative. And Pratibha Nandakumar's instance was a funny one. She says she brought up this instance at a lit fest in Kerala or something, and then it split the crowd in two. They said, "What? This is not poetry. This is prakritam." In the sense, prakrit is contrasted with refined Sanskrit or whatever. And then someone stands up in the audience and says, "No, this is prakritam," something. And then the tension is dissolved. But there is, it's still there. I don't think it has gone away. In fact, it might have increased, because I was at an event in Bangalore, an NIF event, and Vasudhendra was there. He was on a panel, and someone asked him this question: "Well, what do you think about caste and the Kannada literary world?" And he said, "Look, if there is an English discussion like this happening, nobody cares what caste you are, or whether you're LGBTQ or whatever. Everyone treats you as the same. But if there's a Kannada panel discussion happening, there's very acute awareness of what is this writer's social background." And someone else in the audience stood up and said, "This is not just true of Kannada, it's true of other languages as well, because you have a new generation of writers from marginalized backgrounds who are finally staking their claim to these literary environments." And so in that sense, it is to be expected. But again, this how do you respond to this? If writers and intellectuals cannot transcend these divides, how do you expect orthodox society to, right? And so there's a broader cultural argument for inclusiveness that I don't think a lot are making. One of the few people who do make it is Mudnakudu Chinnaswamy. So I wrote a piece in Caravan about him, and I quote one of his excerpts from an essay where he says, if you look at Vedic literature or Dalit Bandaya literature, all of these are sects, and they're perpetuating a kind of sectarian thinking. Sects have no conscience. We need to create a new form of intercaste literature, and for this, we need to go back to, again, he goes back to the Sharana revolution and Basavanna's worldliness and Allama's otherworldliness and Akkamahadevi's spirit. This is what he wants to draw on, to create a new form of non-sectarian, literature. And these are conversations I think we should be having in more frequency. And this is, again, what Arvind Malgatti is trying to say in his critique of Dalit Bandaya. So he says, look, if Shivram Karant or Kuvempu is writing about Dalits, that is exceptional Dalit literature. To argue otherwise would be to lose sight, would be to say that the idea of being a Dalit is again a part of something else. It is not a whole in itself. And this reminded me of Ambedkar's quote where he says, "I am not a part of the whole, I am a part apart." This is the title of Ashok Gopal's new biography of Ambedkar. And so I felt great resonance with what Arvind Malgatti was saying. So even if you can't craft a cultural identity that transcends caste, then you are again perpetuating this scheme of sectarian thinking that has created these identities in the first place. So while there's a different political argument to be made for representation and so on, culturally, if you're not able to unite castes, then where is this anti-caste? Where is this annihilation of caste going to come from, right?
No, that's why I remember in your book you write about the KB Siddhaya saying this fragmentation is good for some reason because when we get a Hureka kind of a movement, all these fragments of Dalit parties, the organizations would come together to strongly counter or make profit out of that movement. So I think here is where I want to talk a little bit about the Dalit movement in Karnataka, right? While the DSS, the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti, have start with huge banger, I think the movement itself has fragmented over time. And even the two spearheads of the movement, if we can say Siddhalingaya as well as Devanur Mahadeva, had different trajectories over time, right? So could you reflect a bit on this fragmentation within the Dalit movement?
So the difference between Siddhalingaya and Devanur Mahadeva is perhaps the political convictions. Mahadeva has never once wavered from what he believed, his appreciation of Lohia and Gandhi and Ambedkar, his opposition to the BJP, that has remained unwavering, only intensified over time. Siddhalingaya was critiqued by others because he became a bit more partial, or he was complacent. He became friendly with the BJP forces. That's what I'm saying. And this is interesting because if you look at someone like Namdeo Dhasal in Maharashtra, the founder of the Dalit Panthers, by the early 2000s, he's becoming soft on the Shiv Sena. He's saying they're not really fascists. And so it's an interesting parallel between Siddhalingaya and Dhasal, perhaps. But nobody, no activist I interviewed ever discounted Siddhalingaya's contribution to the birth of the movement in Karnataka. They celebrated him, and they recognized that he was, in some sense, a very jolly, jovial man who somehow tried to see the best in everyone. This might be political naivety, but it's also, in some sense, a goodness of spirit. And even when I was interviewing Devanur Mahadeva, he was talking about Siddhalingaya as a firebrand figure. He said Siddhalingaya came, he scared all of them, and then everyone was forced to rethink their place in society and so on. And this internal division within the movement itself. I mean, you brought up KB Siddhaya. So there's this video on YouTube where he's reflecting on these divisions. He's saying, yes, I understand everyone's saying these are trivial, but there's also another way of seeing that perhaps when the right moment comes, they will unite and, I heard conflicted views about Siddhaya himself. On the one hand, I saw an extraordinary theatrical production called Daklakatha Devi Kavya. It's an adaptation of one of KB Siddhaya's poetry, which is in some sense championing a subcaste known as the Dakkaliga, who themselves refer to the Madigas as Gaudas, and they're further down in the pecking order in some sense. But I also heard from some people that Siddhaya himself was too invested in Madiga politics, and he was in some sense deviating from the broader Dalit movement. And I wonder if his own thoughts on this, in some sense, a compensation for his other political opinions over the course of his life. And an interesting, intriguing, and unfortunate divide I found was between Devanur Mahadeva and another DSS activist in Mysore named H. Govindaya, who'd once been his close friend, part of the movement, editor of the Panchama magazine, but now he's become this huge critic of Devanur Mahadeva. And Govindaya told me that it was the differences between the Holaya Madigas that themselves, that itself created a broader fissure in the Dalit movement. And this reflected also in his own animosity towards Mahadeva. And in August last year, when Supreme Court, sanctioned internal reservations, Devnath Mahadeva wrote a piece, an essay where he welcomed it, and he said explicitly, it is not anybody else who made Dalits political untouchables. We have ourselves contributed to this, and it is up to us now to treat this as a positive sign and to mend these broken relationships. We've become tired of this. This is perhaps a way to reconcile these differences and put these fractured pasts behind us. And there's a very acutely self-aware moment, I think. And yeah, I think it's interesting thing to reflect on.
No, okay, next I want to a little bit jump from what we are talking. I want to talk about three individuals in specific that you have spoken about in this book. The first one is somebody who you share your initials with, right? Saketh Rajan, right? And so in your book, when you interviewed one of his co-comrades, right, Noor Sridhar Zulfikar, he said Saketh Rajan is and I quote, Saketh Rajan is a good example for how a man from strong intellectual background could stumble in life. One may be able to think about a lot of grand things, but completely fumble the simpler ones. And I stop quote, right? So Saketh Rajan life is a reflection of the greater Naxal movement, the trajectory of Naxal movement in the state of Karnataka. So tell us about Saketh Rajan, and I also want you to reflect on why did the Naxal movement fail in Karnataka? Is it because of their method, or they did not understand the social realities of Karnataka at large?
Yeah, it was a form of highly romanticized idealism, completely unmoored from realities in Karnataka. So it's one thing for the Naxal movement in the forests of Dandakaranya, where there is this new neoliberal push for claiming land and driving out communities and so on. But to take that to a place like Karnataka, which has very different conditions, and to argue for a militant struggle, so it was extremely dangerous and impractical and unmoved from reality. I was reading recently the autobiography of the writer Mugali Ganesh, who's a Mysore-based, not Mysore-based, but he grew up in Mysore. He knew Saketh. He's a short story writer, novelist. He has a new autobiography called Naan Embudu Kinchittu. And I wish I'd encountered this while I was writing the book, because there's a very interesting anecdote about Saketh Rajan. So while Mugali Ganesh was doing his MA in Mysore, he knew Saketh. And at the end of his MA, after he's finished it, he remembers midnight, Saketh Rajan comes to his home. He's like, "You finish your MA. Are you ready? Are you ready to come to the forest with us?" And Mugali Ganesh is like, "What do you mean?" He uses one word. He says, "Final solution." Saketh is like, "We're going to the final solution." And I mean, I would have definitely loved to include this in the book if I'd come across it, because it tells you the fatalism and the wildness of what they're trying to, embark on, this enormous sense of reclaiming the past and being a liberator. And it comes with a sense of ego also, I think, to think that you alone with some 20 people who are following you can somehow topple the state and bring in revolution. It's hopelessly idealistic. And all the recollections of people, including his own comrades who left the movement and emerged into civil society, they said, "No, this is we we really believed that this might actually usher in. It was a very naive belief. And on a very small level, you can be sympathetic to it, but we owe history only truth, and you have to look at these in a very critical tenor. And though Saketh has this alibi of martyrdom encountered, shouldn't have been killed that way. I don't think he was that big a danger or anything of that sort. There could have been negotiations, but because he himself seems to have had a kind of a death wish that would never come to be, and I became interested because he had left behind a body of work, his 2 volumes of history of Karnataka, making history. So there is a genuinely talented researcher in him. Just the enormity of the task he's brought on, the amount of books he's read, and the sheer work that has gone into it. But on the other hand, also, you see that this is a man who's incapable of acknowledging criticism and contestation. And if he had ever sorted out this project, could have turned out to be much better. He might have been alive. But this is the messiness of history. How do you engage with these ideas, these radical ideas, these good intentions that turn sour? And it's a matter of shame, I think, ultimately. And I I found myself relating to him in some senses. This desire to confront one's privilege and find out, how you can contribute to uh, the making of a better society. But in spite of that, his tale is cautionary, and of course, it's moving, and it uh, it became a launchpad for me personally in terms of finding a personal foothold in this book as well. It was the first thing I became interested in, and first thing I started writing about and researching in. Though it eventually became one of 12 chapters in the book itself, um, everybody has their own personal valence to whatever becomes their book project, and this was mine.
No, I'm sure you felt a lot of resonance. I mean, I was able to find the 2 volumes making history in the Library Genesis. And though I haven't read them, but I'm like thankful for the sheer documentation he have done, right?
Exactly.
Of
Yeah.
quoting the pictures, etc., etc. So I'm glad it survived with us. The second individual I want to talk about is Shankar Mokashi Punekar, right? And especially his views on Brahmanism, right? And one quote which especially caught my attention, which you document in your book, as Shankar saying, and I quote, Brahmanism does not mean the social or economic supremacy of Brahmins or the intellectual superiority of the Brahmin class. What it meant was dependence, expectation, and demand made by the entire Hindu community from Brahmin ritual, and I stop quote, right? Give your reflection on your interview and your conversation which you had with Shankar.
So that line should be seen in the context of some of his other assertions, because there seems to be both truth and fantasy in there. Because on one level, that is itself a very Brahminical thing to say. See that no, everyone needed Brahmins. We were there for welfare of society and all of that. It's very naive. But on the other hand, there's also this question of why Brahminism proved so attractive for kings and royal houses across history, because it did not spread through missionaries or crusaders or other conventional religious ways. So there's this book by the scholar Johannes Bronkhorst, book How the Brahmins Won, and so he argues that this thing called Brahmanism is a socio-political ideology rather than a religion. It thrived because of its storytelling. Think of the enormous popularity of the stories in the epics and in the Puranas and so on. And also these ideologies gain traction through co-option and capitulation. It doesn't, it's not helpful to see them as being this constantly oppressive force all the time, because um, kings and various communities that were looking to, you know, uh, emerge higher in the caste system, they use these ideologies to empower themselves and to look down on others. And I got a very interesting anecdote from Manu S. Pillai, because Shankar Mokashi Punekar also mentions the Peshwas. So he thinks it was only during the time of the Peshwas that Brahmins wielded power and enforced them. Apart from this, he doesn't see in history great instances of Brahmin domination. That again is a contestable claim. But his mention of the Peshwas was interesting because Manu told me of a story of one of the last Peshwas who went about destroying sections of the Skanda Purana because it had unflattering remarks about the origins of the Konkanastha Brahmins. And the Peshwas were a very self-consciously Brahminical regime. And they went out of their way to act as conservative Brahmins precisely because they were not seen as conservative Brahmins. So this, in some sense, gives a bit of truth to that sentence you quoted of Shankar Mokashi Punekar. In that sense, there was exterior forces to reinforcing Brahminism that didn't come from Brahmins themselves. It expanded as an ideology out of the ambit of just one community. It was, and Ambedkar actually keeps talking about this all the time. He says, what I mean by Brahminism is not the practices of this one community, but the negation of liberty and freedom that is injected into Hindu society at large. In some sense, it encompasses all castes. And I found Punekar interesting because there is both a conservative and a progressive in him. You know, on the one hand, he recognizes the sheer inhumanity of the caste system, the lack of an egalitarian dharma in the past, and he says India did not worship intelligence, and therefore did not foster secular humanism and a competitive economy. But on the other hand, he can't easily bring himself to pass ethical judgments on the past. He says there's one telling line. He says we can't compare ourselves to the great teachers of the past and keep perpetuating ideas that Brahmins fought Kshatriyas, Kshatriyas fought Shudras, Hindus fought Muslims. There is in these various passages I quote a deeper argument between the left and the right. It's like Punekar is playing both sides of a chess game, And in this process, he comes up with some very interesting assertions. On the one hand, he has this utopian idea that all castes somehow work cooperatively with each other. It's a very naive generalization, but he does recognize this idea that what we call Brahminical hierarchy, in some sense, imposed itself on all castes in different measures, and you need to recognize that to historicize this ideology we know as Brahminism, which has become something of a political volleyball. It's just everyone talks about this without nuance. The right wing also capitalizes on this. They can get away with saying things like, caste didn't exist until the British came, or something like that. So it's not helpful in broader conversation to keep these nuances out of it. So in this sense, I felt it was very interesting to engage with Shankar Mokashi Punekar's ideas, and it pushed me into excavating interesting bits of history with regards to what we know as Brahminism. One thing that misses our contemporary discourse is that Brahmins weren't always a homogeneous category, despite the strong sense of endogamy. Goes back hundreds of years. For instance, I quote a paragraph from Wendy Doniger, where she says, in medieval India, around the time the Puranas were being composed, there were Mlecha Brahmanas, Shudra Brahmanas, Chandala Brahmanas. Some of them very close to the folk sources they incorporated into the Puranas. And so these ideas were at some point quite fluid. We would be mistaken in painting a homogeneous story of 3,000 years of the same kind of identity, which is what a lot of contemporary discourse tends to do. But actually, it's much more complex than that. For instance, there's one more instance I quote about the Boya tribe when it's emerging into urban civilization around the 10th century something. So they were Boya Brahmanas and Boya Kshatriyas, and they were accepted by mainstream society based on these divisions that they already had in them. What does this really tell us? And if we look at the rise of kingdoms, for instance, the Hoysalas, the greatest kingdoms of Karnataka, according to the historian Duncan Derritt, they were Boyas. They were Bedas of the Beda tribe. And the Bedas themselves keep coming up in history. For instance, after the collapse of the Vijayanagara Empire, there's this rise of new Beda principalities, new Beda kings. In present day terms, they would be scheduled tribe Shaivas. But do these new labels help us situate them in the past with in the context that they found themselves in? Perhaps not. So at every point in history, when you look at particular geographies and particular beliefs, there is always some different nuance that gives us a much more wholesome, complex picture of how caste operated. And the more we go back in history, the less evidence we have for how exactly the lived experiences of different castes were. It becomes more muddy, and I think we should have a little more caution when we're talking about particular spaces rather than these big generalizations that somehow pervaded the entire subcontinent. That it's much more complex than that.
No, while you're talking about the Peshwas, I remember reading in Who Was Shivaji, Govind Pansara's work. There also he speaks about how during Shivaji time, right, there's conversion from Hindu to Muslim, Muslim to Hindu again, that kind of a thing. But when it moved to Peshwas, that completely stormed to an extent that Peshwa can't convert his own son from Muslim to a Hindu, right? So it's an interesting thing to talk about. At the last of our interview, I want to talk about one more person, I think, who you write most fondly about in your book, the Syed Issaq, right? You introduce, you introduce and you talk about him.
So I came across him during the pandemic. I was not in Mysore. I was in Mumbai or something. There was a story of a library that burnt down in Mysore, and I was appalled, like what happened. And then I heard that this man called Syed Issaq has built up a public library with thousands of books, mostly Kannada books. And in the aftermath of this, so many people, Kannadigas from across the globe, they sent money and books and helped him rebuild the library. It was a very heartwarming story. And then later, when I dug into that story, it turned out not the first time that his library had burned down. It happened once before by whom he calls anti-Kannada lumpen elements. And so I was even more fascinated when I heard that Syed Issaq was illiterate, that he couldn't himself read books, but he'd spent more than a decade of his life championing this public library for the locals of his Muslim-dominated locality called Rajiv Nagar in Mysore. So I met him. I went to the library a couple of times. I helped him organize his books, and I heard his story. And he was talking about this wonderful syncretic past in Srirangpatna, which is where he was from. He was a bonded laborer. He had been bonded very early, and then some disagreement, or not a disagreement. He had been given 1 or 2 rupees to buy something. Someone cheated it out of him, and he couldn't face his landlord. So the young boy ran away from his home, from Srirangpatna. He fainted somewhere near Mandya or something, and then some other local uh, landlord brought him up, and he was distant from his family all this time. He gets reunited with them two, almost 2 decades after that, or something like that. And during this time, the one source of his life's joy was Rajkumar movies. So he said he watched some 183 Rajkumar movies, and the very exact number. Like he had remembered every single one of them. And he spoke in this rich, luminous Kannada that he had absorbed from these Rajkumar movies, though he himself was illiterate. And so in his public library, the biggest photo was that of Rajkumar, and there were other photos, Kuempu, and a whole bunch of people. And in the middle, there was a Quran, copy of Kuempu's Ramayana Darshanam, copy of the Bible. This was the centerpiece. And so he told me, look, in places like Vijayanagara, Agrahara, and all, you don't need libraries because education has already reached. But in this place, this is a slum. There is no education. There are no proper library. There are no proper schools. Only the politicians here have not done anything. So I wanted to start a library, and I'm sure for some children, students there, it's a cultural revolution in its own right. And I found in Syed Issaq a form of anarchism, again, a form of saying, I will do this without any help. I will act as if I'm already free. I don't need anybody's help. So he himself cleans out this large garbage dump that has been stinking up that place. He fences it with bamboo. He starts this whole library. He starts collecting books in newspapers, using his own money all the time. Even now, he spends from his own pocket, gets newspapers every day. And I thought it was an extraordinary story, which more of us should imbibe. If he can do this, what is stopping you from changing whatever corner of the universe you live in, and making it a better place for people? And so in him, there was a metaphor of the power of civil society stand up for itself, to shame the state, to say, look, you don't do anything, look what I can do on my own. And how does that make you feel, right? So that was a wistful, heartwarming way to end the book also. And I think it worked out well.
It really did. Like in your last paragraph in your book, I think you write this sentence, and I quote about Syed, that by demonstrating how individuals can single handedly empower their communities, he's shaming the non power of the non performing state, right? And I think that's a powerful way of looking at Syed Issaq's work. So after burning, he again started his library, he again built one.
Yeah, after the pandemic, he started one. It's going quite strong. There are more books than ever. There's some 17,000, 18,000 books or something. Most of them are Kannada. And there were very good books also, like not cheap pulp fiction or anything of that sort. Good literary quality. So he had gotten um, people to send him good books. And I enjoyed lounging there, picking out some interesting books and reading and so on. And so, yeah, I mean, we need more Syed Issaqs, to put it in a nutshell.
Srikar Raghavan. Thank you so much for your time, right? And I genuinely appreciate your work, because I think this book should be a template for how every Indian language people should write a book about their own cultural history, right? Because what is interesting is you're not just writing the chronological history of the state, but you have seen the literature and also interviews and see how they reflect on the moment that we are particularly living in. I think this book is a gesture, as you've spoken about Mahadeva's work in your book. And thank you so much, Srikar.
Thank you. I had a nice time. I mean, I discovered things that I wanted to say that I had not said before. So it was a very nice space to reflect on the book. And yeah, I hope it'll be interesting other people, listeners.
Thank you, Srikar.
Thank you.